What if the laughter you once heard on television was born from silence, isolation, and fear? What if the child who made millions smile never had the chance to smile himself? Jay North, some of you might recall the name faintly. A flicker from the black and white era of television. A platinum-haired boy with a slingshot in his back pocket. The poster child of innocent rebellion. He was Dennis the Menace, America's lovable troublemaker. But the real trouble wasn't on screen. It was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Behind locked dressing rooms and promotional smiles. And today, we're asking the hard question, when children become celebrities, do we celebrate them or sell them? Welcome to Tragedy Uncovered, where we don't just report stories. We dissect the pain behind the persona. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what you're about to hear is not the sanitized, glossy version of Hollywood. This is the part they left out. Jay North's story doesn't begin with disaster. It begins like so many other American dreams, young, bright, full of promise. He was born in 1951, right in Hollywood's backyard. His mother, Dorothy, wasn't some fame-chasing parent. In fact, she worked as a secretary for a television union. She knew the risks of the industry. Ironically, it was that knowledge that introduced Jay to it. When a small chance came up for him to appear on local children's TV, she allowed it, but cautiously. The world saw a charming boy with screen presence. But one person saw more: Hazel McMillan, a powerful talent agent who believed Jay was made for the spotlight. And that's how it started. Not with greed, not with parental pressure, but with a boy who lit up a screen and an industry that couldn't resist monetizing that light. Jay's early appearances snowballed. Commercials, modeling gigs, variety shows. He wasn't just talented, was bankable. And then came the role that would define, and ultimately consume, him, Dennis the Menace. He was only 8 when CBS gave him the lead in what would become one of America's most beloved sitcoms. Millions watched weekly. Jay was earning thousands per episode, unthinkable for a child actor at the time. But money doesn't buy childhood. Behind the scenes, Jay's mother remained at her full-time job. She didn't touch his earnings. She even hired business managers to protect them. But she made one crucial mistake. She trusted family. She appointed her sister Marie and brother-in-law Hal Hopper to be Jay's guardians on set. And that decision would scar him for life. The Hoppers were not nurturing. They were not supportive. They were controlling, punitive, and secretive. Jay was forbidden from socializing with other child actors or crew. He ate meals alone. He was isolated physically and emotionally. And if he made mistakes, he was punished harshly. Slaps, threats, verbal abuse, all carefully delivered where no one could see or hear. Abuse without witnesses. And Jay, he never told. He couldn't. Because when your abuser also controls your access to everything: food, freedom, affection, you learn quickly that silence is survival. What's shocking isn't just the abuse, it's the total absence of oversight. Where were the producers? Where were the child welfare officers? Why didn't anyone on set question why this bright kid was becoming withdrawn, tired, anxious? The answer is chillingly simple. Jay smiled on cue. He hit his marks. He said his lines. In the eyes of adults, that meant he was fine. But he wasn't. And that's where this story stops being about one child and starts being about us. How many more Jay Norths have we celebrated, cheered, and forgotten, all while ignoring the cost of their fame? How many child stars have given us our nostalgia, while losing themselves in the process? This is not just a retrospective. It's an autopsy of innocence, commodified, of silence, institutionalized, and of a young boy who was never allowed to grow up because his image was too profitable to let go. As Dennis the Menace climbed the television ratings, Jay's fame skyrocketed, but so did his sense of isolation. Every smile delivered to the audience became a deeper fracture within himself. Fame, for Jay, wasn't a door to opportunity, it was a trap he couldn't escape. As the show continued, his income increased, his exposure grew, and yet he was more alone than ever. He was America's child, but no longer his own. By season 3, Jay was pulling in the equivalent of what some adults made in a year. But he wasn't playing with toys or attending school dance. She was reading cue cards and selling laundry detergent in sponsor commercials. On weekends, rather than riding bikes or going to the movies, he was flown across the country for promotional appearances, always under the tight grip of the hoppers. Wherever Jay went, his guardians followed not for support, but control, and the world applauded, never questioning what that kind of schedule did to a child's development. Even when he stumbled over a line or missed a cue, something natural for a child was swiftly punished by Marie Hopper. She hit him, not in anger, but with intent, never on the face, always in places that wouldn't be visible. That kind of precision reveals something deeply disturbing. This wasn't frustration. It was methodical, calculated control. Jay wasn't just acting for an audience, he was acting to survive. And what was the cost of that survival? He had no friends. He was kept from other child actors, isolated in his dressing room, fed separately from the cast and crew. His only companionship was the pressure to perform and the fear of disappointing the very people assigned to protect him. In 1962, tragedy struck on set when Joseph Kearns, the actor who played Mr. Wilson and one of the few people Jay trusted, passed away. Kearns had been a father figure, kind, steady, and warm. His death shook Jay not just emotionally but symbolically. It marked the collapse of the last safe space in his working world. Without Kearns, the environment became colder, and Jay's dread of the set grew stronger. By season 4, Jay's salary had reached $3.500 per episode, an astronomical sum at the time. But no amount of money could restore what he had lost, a childhood. His emotions were no longer buried under the weight of responsibility, they were suffocating beneath it. He didn't just outgrow the show. He emotionally disconnected from it. Dennis the Menace had taken everything from him and given nothing back but exhaustion and anxiety. When the show was canceled in 1963, millions of Americans felt a pang of nostalgia. For Jay, it was relief. No farewell speech, no commemorative moment, just the sound of the studio doors closing in with them. The most traumatic chapter of his young life. Yet, the damage didn't evaporate with the cancellation. It had already taken root. His mother, recognizing how broken he had become, enrolled him in prep school in hopes he'd assimilate into normal life. But after years of working on set, where adults dictated his every move and tutoring came in 3-hour shifts between filming, Jay didn't fit in. He didn't understand how to socialize with other kids. He was academically behind, emotionally distanced, and culturally alienated. He wasn't just removed from school life, he had never been part of it in the first place. Casting directors didn't help. To them, Jay was and always would be Dennis. It didn't matter how tall he got or how much his voice changed. The industry had frozen him in time. And no matter how badly he wanted to evolve as an actor, they only saw the boy in the overalls. The Hollywood machine, which had crafted his image so precisely, now rejected him for the very same reason. He was too recognizable. He was typecast by his own trauma. Still, Jay persisted. In 1966, he landed a lead role in a film called Maya, a dramatic adventure set in the jungles of India. It was everything Dennis wasn't: serious, expansive, and emotionally layered. It was a brief reprieve from his past. The film's moderate success led NBC to greenlight a series adaptation. Jay had a second chance, but even that came with a cost. The director of Maya was known for explosive temper tantrums on set. Screaming matches were frequent. Jay had escaped the hoppers, but not the volatility of production environments. It was another example of how child actors, even as teens, were seen not as young people, but as professional tools to be used, managed, and discarded. The Menace series was short-lived, canceled after just one season due to poor ratings. Once again, Jay's hope for reinvention was cut short. After filming Wrapped, he returned to high school and finally graduated in 1969. It was, in many ways, his first real milestone outside of show business. A quiet victory in a life that had known very little peace. But his image still haunted him, no matter how many roles he took, or how far he tried to step away. Dennis followed him like a shadow. That leads us to a disturbing realization: when a child becomes a product, what happens when the market no longer wants that product? For Jay North, it meant living with the remnants of a persona that no longer served him but never truly belonged to him either. Even after leaving the spotlight, Jay North couldn't escape the ghost of Dennis. But to understand why, we need to turn our attention to the people and institutions who surrounded him, not just those who harmed him, but those who stood by and did nothing. Because in every child star tragedy, there are two types of perpetrators: the active abuser and the silent observer. Marie and Hal Hopper, Jay's aunt and uncle, were the most obvious villains in this story. Entrusted as his legal guardians, they were given complete access to his day-to-day life. But rather than providing safety and support, they imposed a regime of fear. Jay later spoke about the strict control they held over him, his movements, his diet, his associations. It was more than just overbearing parenting. It was psychological manipulation and systematic emotional abuse. The fact that Marie hid him in places that wouldn't leave marks speaks to a calculated cruelty. She knew exactly what she was doing and how to keep it hidden. That wasn't ignorance. That was intent. But what about the producers? The directors? The adult actors on set? Were they truly oblivious? Or was it simply easier to look away? Jay was a child under enormous pressure, working adult hours, generating adult-level income, and held to adult expectations but without any of the protections or agency of an adult. The entertainment industry at the time had no formal protections for child actors beyond vague labor guidelines. No on-set counselors, no third-party advocates, and certainly no protocols for investigating abuse. Silence wasn't just common, it was embedded. Even Dorothy, Jay's mother, though arguably well-intentioned, must be viewed through a critical lens. She didn't exploit her son financially. She kept working full-time and left his earnings untouched, but she also wasn't present. By outsourcing his care to family members and choosing to stay uninvolved with his daily work life, she unknowingly enabled years of suffering. The paradox is painful. She tried to do right by him and still failed him. It highlights a deeper truth about child stardom. Love and good intentions are not enough. Presence matters. Supervision matters. And in Jay's case, it was absent when it counted most. Then there's Hazel McMillan, the talent agent who first spotted Jay. Her role was foundational. She opened the door to his career. But like so many in Hollywood, she was part of the machine that prioritized exposure and earnings over well-being. Once Jay was cast, her job was done. That's the problem. In an industry built on constant turnover, child actors are passed from agent to manager to studio to parent. Like a baton in a never-ending relay, each party with limited responsibility, none with lasting accountability. The network executives and studio heads are equally complicit. They marketed Dennis the Menace with fervor posters, merchandise, magazine covers, nationwide promotions. Jay was flown from city to city, sometimes with only hours of rest in between. He wasn't treated as a child. He was a brand, and that brand had to perform. This commodification of children isn't new, but in Jay's case, it was especially stark. They styled his hair, tailored his speech, curated his smile. Every element of his public persona was engineered for consumption. And what did the audience do? They watched. They laughed. They loved him. And they never asked where the boy went when the camera stopped rolling. This is the most insidious aspect of Jay North's story, not just the abuse, but the silence, the cultural silence, the institutional silence, the complicity of a system that pretends innocence while consuming it. Even the U.S. Navy, which Jay joined in 1977 hoping to reinvent himself, couldn't separate the man from the myth. Instead of treating him as a recruit, they mocked him as Dennis. Officers and peers alike turned his identity into a joke. His reputation preceded him, and it followed him into every bunk, every corridor. So much for a fresh start. This tells us something profound. Once a child is branded by fame, society rarely lets them grow beyond it. Jay North didn't just battle childhood trauma. He fought a culture that refused to see him as anyone but the boy with the slingshot. Jay North's exit from the spotlight didn't mean the spotlight exited him. Fame, especially when absorbed too young, doesn't fade, it echoes. And in Jay's case, it echoed in every rejection, every misunderstanding, and every attempt he made to live a normal life. The trauma wasn't just emotional. It was existential. Who was he, if not Dennis? What part of his identity was real, and what had been created for public consumption? In the years following his brief resurgence in Maya, Jay tried to rebuild slowly and quietly. He explored voice acting, a space where anonymity was possible and performances didn't require plastered smiles or public appearances. He lent his voice to several animated series. For a moment, it seemed he had found a lane that let him act without being seen. But even this refuge was temporary. Offers dwindled. Recognition faded. And while the world moved on from Dennis the Menace, Jay was left holding all the baggage. In 1973, he married actress Kathleen Brucker. It was a small sliver of hope. But within a year, they had separated. By October 1974, the divorce was final. That same year, Jay made a bold move starring in The Teacher, an R-rated psychological thriller. The film was meant to signal a new era, an adult Jay tackling mature, controversial material. But audiences didn't see an actor stretching his range, they saw Dennis in an inappropriate setting. The dissonance was too great. The reaction was chilly, if not outright uncomfortable. Jay learned something bitter through that experience. No matter how far he ran, he could not outrun the character that had defined him. His attempts at artistic reinvention were constantly dragged back into the context of his childhood role. It wasn't just typecasting. It was identity entrapment. After years of frustration with the industry, Jay did something radical left. He joined the United States Navy, a move many viewed as desperate. But for Jay, it was necessary. The Navy offered structure, anonymity, and he had a chance to rewrite his narrative. But even there, surrounded by uniforms and commands, he couldn't escape the long shadow of Dennis the Menace. He was mocked, harassed, and diminished by those who couldn't see past the character. Not because Jay failed to adapt, but because they refused to. When he returned to civilian life in the late 1970s, he stepped away from Hollywood for good. Thanks to financial decisions made by his mother early in his career, he was able to survive without returning to acting. Real estate investments gave him a level of independence that many child stars never attain. But financial stability didn't equate to peace. Jay spent much of the 1980s grappling with depression, identity crisis, and public irrelevance. In the late 80s, he made a bold, darkly comedic appearance on HBO's Not Necessarily the News, parodying his own image as an adult Dennis. It was a cathartic, almost therapeutic act of public acknowledgement of his pain, masked in satire. It made people laugh. But the subtext was unmistakable. Jay was telling the world that he had been a punchline for decades, and he wanted to own it before it consumed him entirely. That kind of emotional negotiation between persona and persona's one that few child stars survive intact. Jay's resilience wasn't in reinventing himself, but in learning how to live with the fragments. He didn't pretend it never happened. He didn't demonize the character that made him famous. But he also didn't let it define every breath he took. It was a complicated piece, one built slowly, painfully, and at times, bitterly. Still, the emotional residue remained. Interviews from his later life revealed a man still carrying the weight of 1,000 expectations he never asked for. He spoke candidly about the abuse, the isolation, the lost years, and yet, he never framed himself as a victim. That's important. Jay North didn't seek pity, he sought understanding. There's a difference. In 1992, he met Cindy Hackney at a charity event in Florida. A year later, they married. This time, the relationship endured. Jay moved to her hometown of Lake Butler, stepped into the role of stepfather to her daughters, and finally seemed to carve out a space of tranquility. It was not redemption through fame but through love. And that might be the most radical transformation of all. Jay's journey to personal healing was long, imperfect, and paved with silence not just his own, but society's. The truth is, we tend to romanticize child stars. We celebrate their precociousness, marvel at their talent, and conveniently ignore the infrastructure that exploits them. Jay's story isn't just about a child actor who struggled, it's about a culture that rewards the performance but refuses to acknowledge the price. Even as Jay began to speak out in the 1990s, sharing details of his abuse and isolation, the reaction was strangely muted. There were no mainstream media exposés, no official apologies from the networks or producers, no grand industry reckoning. Why? Because child star suffering had been normalized. In a way, it had become expected. Behind every adorable face and Emmy-winning role, there was a tacit assumption. Of course their childhood is hard, this is the cost of fame. That mindset is toxic. It allows adults to remain complicit while hiding behind phrases like, "That's just the business," or "They'll thank us later." But Jay never thanked anyone. In fact, he made it clear that what he endured was not the result of passion or sacrifice, it was exploitation. He was a child, doing a job, under coercion. There's nothing noble about that. Yet public memory often reframes these stories as tales of perseverance rather than what they truly are, warnings. Jay's work in his later years reflected this awareness. He began speaking at juvenile justice centers, mentoring at-risk youth, and supporting organizations like a minor consideration, a group formed to protect the rights of child performers. He didn't just process his pain privately. He turned it into advocacy. That distinction matters. Many former child stars disappear. Jay reappeared not to chase relevance, but to prevent replication. Still, the cultural mechanisms that harmed him remain largely intact. Hollywood continues to cast young children in leading roles. Social media platforms now amplify the issue, parents monetizing their children's lives through vlogs and family content. The faces have changed. The format has shifted. But the principle is the same. Childhood is treated as content. What makes Jay's story especially relevant today is how eerily prescient it feels. He lived in an analog world. Now, in the digital era, the problem has escalated. Children no longer just perform for cameras, they live in front of them. And unlike Jay, many of today's child influencers have no legal protections at all. Their parents are their managers, producers, editors, and in some cases, the ones profiting most from their presence online. Jay's life urges us to question, at what point does parental involvement become parental exploitation? And what safeguards exist when the exploitation is dressed as opportunity? The silence surrounding Jay's abuse wasn't accidental, it was systemic. And that same silence continues today, disguised in the language of ambition, opportunity, and visibility. When a child is rewarded for being famous more than for being whole, we create a value system that is inherently damaging. This raises another uncomfortable truth. Audiences play a role. Every time we binge a show with a 6-year-old lead, or double tap a toddler's viral video, we become participants, not necessarily malicious, but complicit, because attention is the currency that fuels the cycle. And just as Menace the Menace sold ad space in the 60s, today's child creators drive monetization algorithms. Jay never asked for fame. He didn't audition for trauma. But his story forces us to reflect on how entertainment is consumed and what ethical boundaries must exist when the entertainer isn't old enough to sign a contract, let alone understand one. Even institutions like the Navy, supposedly rigid, structured, and apolitical, failed to shield him from ridicule rooted in pop culture. That proves the issue isn't just Hollywood. It's the persistence of identity branding. Once society decides who you are, breaking that mold becomes nearly impossible, especially when your original identity was never yours to shape. And yet, what's most haunting isn't what Jay endured, it's how little changed in response. The industry didn't pause. The system didn't restructure. The audience didn't revolt. Jay's story circulated quietly, often on the margins, framed more as a curiosity than a cautionary tale. That is the legacy of cultural silence. Not dramatic confrontation, but quiet disregard. Not moral panic, but moral fatigue. And in that fatigue, stories like Jay's lose urgency until another child star surfaces with the same bruises under a different name. As Jay North retreated from public life and slowly rebuilt something resembling peace, the world scarcely noticed. The boy once beamed into millions of living rooms became, in the minds of most, a relic, a symbol of another era. But Jay's departure wasn't a disappearance. It was a conscious reclaiming of self. And perhaps that's where the real story lies, not in what was taken from him, but in what little he managed to salvage. In his later years, Jay devoted himself not to reviving his career, but to preventing others from enduring what he did. He became an advocate, not a celebrity. He worked quietly with youth in the juvenile justice system, using his trauma as a tool rather than a wound. For many, he was no longer Menace the Menace. He was the man who showed up when others didn't. There's something profoundly dignified in that. Jay's transformation from exploited child actor to mentor and advocate is rarely celebrated because it lacks the flash we associate with Hollywood redemption arcs. There was no comeback tour, no best-selling memoir, no teary reunion special, just a man who learned to stop performing and start living. When Jay passed away in April 2025, the headlines were respectful but small. The obituaries focused on his role as Menace, his battles with child stardom, and his later work with at-risk youth. It was, in a way, a quiet ending. But for those who truly followed his story, it wasn't closure, it was an echo. What Jay leaves behind isn't a fan base or franchise. He leaves behind a question, one that hasn't been answered by Hollywood, by audiences, or by society at large. When we put a child in front of a camera, what are we asking them to give, and are we prepared to face what they lose? We like to pretend that Jay North was an exception, that his pain was rare, that most child stars come through unscathed. But that narrative is dishonest, and dangerously so. For every famous name we remember, there are dozens who faded out not because of talent, but because of what fame extracted from them. Not all those stories end in public breakdowns. Some end in obscurity, others in addiction, and some, like Jay's, in hard-earned anonymity. But anonymity isn't healing. It's camouflage. Jay learned how to disappear gracefully because visibility had only ever brought him harm. He didn't want revenge. He wanted quiet. That says more about the damage he endured than any headline ever could. There's a final layer to his story that's rarely discussed: the burden of gratitude. Society teaches us to revere those who overcome hardship with grace. But Jay owed the world nothing. He gave us his childhood. He gave us his joy, his image, his time, and his innocence. The idea that he should have also given us forgiveness or an inspirational arc is, frankly, cruel. And yet, he gave anyway. He gave advice to struggling teens. He gave his presence to families in need. He gave his story, not to sell books, but to stop others from repeating it. That is legacy, not in reruns or royalties, but in resistance. Perhaps what Jay's story reveals most starkly is the illusion of choice. We like to believe child actors choose fame. But how much agency does a 6-year-old truly have? The contracts are signed by adults. The schedules are set by producers. The boundaries are defined by markets. And the audience cheers all the while convinced that what they're watching is voluntary. It wasn't. Not for Jay, and not for many who came after him. So we're left with an uncomfortable truth. Child stardom is a system of extraction. It takes, it shapes, it sells, and too often, it abandons. Jay North happened to survive it. Barely. But survival isn't the same as escape. This final chapter isn't meant to indict any single person. It's not about vilifying his mother, his guardians, or even the industry in isolation. It's about the scaffolding we build around talent that is too young to understand the weight of attention and too fragile to bear its consequences alone. Jay's story is over, but the mechanism that created his pain remains intact. Maybe the most honest way to honor him is to stop asking how he coped and start asking why he had to. Perhaps the tragedy of Jay North isn't just about a boy who lost his childhood to fame. Maybe it's about a world that looked at a suffering child and kept watching, laughing, applauding, never pausing to ask what it was really applauding. Jay's story isn't simply a cautionary tale. It's a mirror, and the more we look into it, the more uncomfortable our reflection becomes. Because in a culture obsessed with stars, what happens when the star is too young to understand the contract, too small to carry the weight of millions of expectations, and too scared to say no? What if the problem isn't just the industry? What if the problem is us? The unanswered question isn't how did this happen? It's why does it keep happening? Thank you for staying with us through every chapter of this haunting journey. If this story stirred something and you didn't let it fade, subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you never miss a truth they tried to bury. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.